This is a Dutch testing report tutorial to assist you with the interpretation of your results. This video is for educational information only, not to be taken as medical advice, and the results that we're actually showing on the screen don't belong to an actual patient, just example results to help with the conversation. You've got a lot of data when it comes to the cortisol piece of the test. Probably the primary bit of information is the free cortisol pattern. Probably the top bit of information that people are interested in as it relates to cortisol. So we want to look at free cortisol at 4 different time points. So we have a waking sample. So waking urine doesn't reflect waking cortisol. That urine and that cortisol represents the night production of the free cortisol. So you've got that point, and then a morning sample that's typically collected 2 hours after waking. Now, for the first 10 minutes of the day, the cortisol really shoots up, and it typically stays fairly elevated for an hour to 2 hours. So that sample taken 2 hours after waking is a good representation of that morning surge of cortisol. By the afternoon, it's typically come down quite a bit, and then you've got a bedtime measurement as well. So we've got 4 measurements overall in this particular situation. The free cortisol is fairly normal, but you'll want to assess not just the overall levels, but that actual up and down pattern as it compares to the normal pattern. Then we're going to add the 4 up, which gives you a good idea of the daily total of free cortisol, and again, in this particular case, fairly normal results. So that tells you what's going on with the free bioavailable cortisol, and that's an important measurement. However, it's not your marker for overall production of cortisol. It only represents about 1% of the total production. If you want a better marker for total cortisol production, you want to look at metabolized cortisol. So that's really your marker for total cortisol production. And in this particular case, that's actually elevated. So in spite of the fact that the free cortisol is normal, there is an abundance of cortisol production, which you can see, again, by way of an elevated cortisol production marker. So as we're looking at this, we can add a little bit of information in as well by looking at cortisone. So cortisol is made by the adrenal gland in response to ACTH. ACTH is a signaling hormone coming from the brain to the adrenal gland, which then makes cortisol. It circulates as both cortisol and cortisone, its inactive form. So it's going back and forth and up and down throughout the day between cortisol and cortisone. So because of that, it's good to confirm what that up and down pattern is by looking also at the inactive cortisone. Cortisol being primary and cortisone being a secondary bit of information, but it can help to confirm what's going on with that story. The enzyme that's responsible for converting between the two is called 11-beta-HSD, and there are 2 forms of that. So that's depicted by this two-headed arrow here. So again, the back and forth between cortisol, and then it's metabolized to both cortisol and cortisone metabolites. And again, for the total production of cortisol, that's really what we want to look at, that metabolized cortisol marker. And again, in this particular case, it's out of range on the high side, which implies that cortisol and cortisone metabolism may well be upregulated, right? If the free cortisol is normal and the metabolites of cortisol are elevated, it could imply that there's an increase in that actual clearance of cortisol. You'll see that in obesity, excess thyroid, perhaps long-term exposure to elevated cortisol or cortisol-like medications. In other cases, you may get quite the opposite, where, let's say, the free cortisol overall is fairly elevated and the metabolites are low. In a case like that, it implies sluggish cortisol clearance, which you'll see in low thyroid and low liver function. But again, in this particular case, there seems to be an increase in production and in cortisol clearance. The other factor that can affect what's going on with the cortisol as it goes up and down throughout the day and is produced is whether or not there is a preference in terms of forcing cortisol towards its inactive cortisone or keeping it in the active form as cortisol. Now, it's tempting to conclude which is the case by looking at the free cortisol and free cortisone and seeing which one seems to predominate. But the literature would suggest, the scientific literature, that the better marker for that is really to look at the cortisol metabolites relative to the cortisone metabolites. And that's what this index will tell you. It will point in this direction if there's a favoring of the cortisol metabolites, and it will point in this direction if there's a favoring of the cortisone metabolites. In a case like this where production of cortisol is elevated, if there's a favoring of cortisone metabolites, that may be some sort of compensatory mechanism to push the cortisol away from cortisol because there's an excess of production. And again, if it points more towards cortisol, then that may exacerbate any high cortisol symptoms that there may be in a situation where the free cortisol is plenty high overall and the total production is fairly elevated. So that should give you a good idea of the overall cortisol look, the free cortisol over time, the total of the production, and then any metabolic preference that there may be in your particular case. If you have any questions, please do see DutchTest.com for some additional information and educational videos. If you have questions from the perspective of a patient, please do see your healthcare provider for those, and we thank you for testing with us.